Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we're still working with the section of al-Akhdari that is dealing with the prostration of unmindfulness or forgetfulness. And we mentioned that this section of al-Akhdari is considered to be one of the most detailed, and I said one of the most detailed, not the most detailed, but one of the most detailed treatments of the topic. And in addition to that, we wanted to use it as an explanation or as a gateway to understand the subject matter that is presented in the ladder of guidance, right? Although the ladder of guidance, it doesn't go into as much detail, the as al-Akhdari, but this section does, right? Of al-Akhdari that we're taking. Now, one of the things that comes up, and I'm not recalling if I mentioned it or not, is that in contemporary Maliki fiqh, there's been a lot of discussions with regard to such the sahu or, or such the sahu, the prostration of forgetfulness. And so, along with those discussions have come publications. And so you can find most, of course, a lot of this stuff is in Arabic, but it's good knowledge to have an understanding of. Some of it is in English. Periodically, you can find it here and there, sometimes as a um, a dissertation topic, master's degree, PhD, or somebody translated, and we were not familiar with a translation with limited publication. So there may be something that is out there in English. That's the point that I'm mentioning in what is going on in contemporary Maliki fiqh. So our knowledge, or the knowledge that we have of something not existing, doesn't determine its existence because our knowledge of that thing may be limited. That's the point there to mention that. And that's a point in logic as well. يعني عدم العلم بشيء أو الإدراك بشيء لا يدل على العلم بالعدم. Our limitation in understanding or our lack of knowledge with regard to a thing doesn't mean that it does not exist. That's an important principle from an epistemological stance, meaning a knowledge-based stance. And the reason why, because a lot of us, when we are asked something or something is presented, the first thing you hear, especially from North American students from the US, first thing you hear is this idea of, I didn't hear about it, and I didn't hear about it is an attempt to negate what is being said. There's never a questioning of the self. And unfortunately, if we have anything to critique about modernity or about Western white culture, this is part of the reality, the individualism that eventually leads to a mental health crisis, right? Because it's so focused on the self. So in any event, there's a sidebar issue, but the contemporary publications of just dealing with it's sajda sahu, just dealing with sajda sahu or the prostration forgetfulness, they have transcended al-Akhdari as well. They if include al-Akhdari, but on some minor points they have transcended. Now, as far as I don't necessarily like this term, but the classical texts, those texts which have outlived this time or their time, al-Akhdari remains to be a reference. And as some of the Mashaykh have said, even exceeding that which is in what we call mutawalat or the encyclopedic referential texts, the texts that are studied at the advanced level or that are used for research. So, just like we mentioned before, we mentioned again, there's that statement, ما في النهر ليس في البحر. That which is in the river is not that which is in the sea, right? And so that's how some of the statements that have been made in the circles of knowledge are points of wisdom. So that which you find in the smaller texts doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find it in the larger text or more advanced text. There's no, like the point of al-Akhdari. You can go to even Khalil, which is considered to be the higher tier or the referential book for study at the higher level, Khalil and his explanations. You go to Khalil and you're not going to find as much as you find in al-Akhdari about this topic, right? And so that should kind of uh, frame our mindset. The same thing with the 40 Hadith. The 40 Hadith, people underestimate it. They think it's like a child's book. And you find this mostly among people from overseas because they have exposure to it. And then sometimes some of us, like, we don't know about the variety of books and we take the smaller books and we take them and we put them in a place where they shouldn't have. But the idea is not to take knowledge for granted and to know how to value each thing. Like the 40 hadith, first 25 hadith are collected by Imam Ibn Salah, not Imam al-Nawawi. And those hadith, Imam al-Nawawi took them and he built on them. But the 40 hadith, it gives you a very comprehensive understanding of Islam. And not only that, the first 25 hadith are considered to be comprehensive hadith. Hadith, which are the referential ahadith, that other ahadith basically can be subsumed under them, these 25 ahadith, because they're called al-hadith al-kulliyah or hadith with universal import, universal meaning. The point of mentioning that is that there also is a text which is taken for granted. It's taken for granted and is considered to be simple. And I'll make a statement and we'll move forward. But, also to be honest with you, may Allah forgive us. I ask Allah for forgiveness as well on a personal level. But the Quran is like that, especially when it comes to Aqidah. It's taken for granted. The books of the scholars are given a lot of weight, sometimes more than the Quran. And that is a harsh statement to make, but it's a reality we need to wake up to. So the Quran becomes displaced in terms of its fundamental role in knowledge. The hadith, for some people, are like that as well. Uh, they downplay the hadith, and then the same problem that happens with some smaller texts. Ahadith are given more standing than the Quran, and they come to replace the Quran for some people in their thinking because they don't spend any time with the Quran other than in a symbolic way. So, in the organization of knowledge, the Quran is the foundation, and the Sunnah is the clarification, we should say, in the elaboration of what is in the Quran. And then after the Quran and the Sunnah, you have ijtihad, like Imam Shafi'i said. And that ijtihad can lead in a lot of different ways. Ijtihad can lead to the development of fiqh as we know it in terms of the realm of halal and haram, or it can lead to the development of other insights into the Quran and the Sunnah outside of just focus on the boundaries of action. It can lead to the knowledge of psychological well-being, which is a term that's being used in Islamic psychology circles. Instead of saying mental health, they're saying psychological well-being with the idea of including the whole human being. It can lead to the tie-in between Aqid and the study of history or belief in the study of history. It can lead to a lot of different sciences. Ijtihad in the widest sense is open, like Muhammad Iqbal said, and others. That's an important concept. But that's where the role of reason is at. And and those are pretty much the three major sources of knowledge. Some people may ask, okay, what about consensus? Well, the reality of consensus is that consensus is based on the Quran and the Sunnah, or the ijma' of the Ummah, or ijma' in general is based on Quran and Sunnah. It's not a proof that's independent of the text. But ijtihad also includes other sources of knowledge other than just rational sources of knowledge, because it can include scientific knowledge, which is based on experience. And from there, we don't want to say that it's an actual proof, but from there, people that practice the deen, they call it tajarrub too. They use the same word as scientific experimentation. Those people who practice the deen and they have taqwa of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, they gain an insight into the deen, and so they have experience in dealing with the spiritual world. They have experience in dealing with life. And so they learn, they're given wisdom as to how to implement the deen, which is a little different than what we call the sunnah as being wisdom. Right. In any event, that discussion, it pertains to the knowledge of the sources or epistemology and usul al-fiqh and other sciences as well. So we covered a nice portion of this text so far. We covered the foundational introduction with regard to Sajda Sahu. We got to the place where we were talking about Sajda Sahu in recent times. We talked about Sajda Sahu and the problem of determining it as a sunnah, right? Um, we were reviewing last time. Here it says the Sahu. It says Sajda Sahu is a sunnah. And we talked a little bit about that. And al-Akhdari, interestingly enough, subtly he combines the both rulings on it. And that is because within the madhab there is some discussion on it. But how is it that Sajda Sahu can be considered to be a sunnah? And then when you go deeper into the discussion, especially when it comes to this section here, people, this section which is dealing with Sajda Sahu, that is performed before the salah, before the salam, I'm sorry, before the salam, it says that there are some situations in which if it's left off, the prostration for forgetfulness will become invalid, and the prayer for which the two prostrations for forgetfulness also become invalid. So we mentioned in some ways that appears to be a contradiction because how can the sunnah, the absence, the ruling of the sunnah, which is supposed to be the act which is rewarded. This is one just basic definition, and not punished. Is rewarded if performed, if not performed, and not punished if not performed. We talked about that as well. And we mentioned that the sajda cell that comes before, there's a couple ways to look at it. Within the madhab, there's a discussion, and that's why it comes up. The language here then is not as tight as we would like, that it's sunnah. What I mean by as tight is that it's talking about the sajda that is performed before the salam, al-qabli is called. The details are not captured in this ruling. The details of that sajda, right, is not captured or are not captured in the ruling or in the way that is initially spoken about. Because you have this judgment that says sajda sahu is sunnah, right? Sajda sahu is sunnah. So that's a general ruling, but it's not all encompassing. Not in every case is it sunnah. That's something that has to be understood. Unfortunately, to be honest, you don't find that discussion in a lot of texts. You have to go deep or you have to be exposed to someone that understands the nuances in that regard. And we use that as an example to say that studying these texts alone, aside from the problems in translation, studying these texts without a circle of knowledge that has some understanding, or without people of knowledge that have access, is just as problematic as reading a hadith uh, by yourself. And we mentioned that. So some of the criticism that was waived or put to the Salafi dawah is the same type of criticism that we put to those that read what are being called traditional texts. Traditional texts are not designed like modern texts, contemporary texts, to be read alone. They're designed to be read with scholars and in a circle of knowledge as well. That's the way that those books are designed. There's no way of getting around that, no matter who says it, right? Because anybody of knowledge would never say that these texts are just read by themselves or read outside of the circle of knowledge. That's why we have the term Sahafi. The idea of Sahafi is the one that teaches himself by books. So they say, يعني أخطاء الصحفي أكثر من الثواب, that the mistakes of a person that teaches themselves by way of books without really having suhbah with the ulama, which is different than having suhbah with the mashaykh, because the Sufis have a concept of suhbah and their idea is different than knowledge in that regard. Their idea is barakah, and their idea is to be in the presence of their sheikh or their sheikha. But the idea there is not the initial idea of suhbah is knowledge, and then along with that comes other things like barakah and so on and so forth. But the foundation is knowledge. Imam Ahmed Zarruq and others, they point to this reality. A person that's known for taqwa uh, in the sense of piety, right? Uh, their taqwa, if it's not rooted in knowledge, only benefits them. Because once they stop being people of taqwa, there's nothing left behind it. But a person of knowledge, even if they're not from the people of taqwa, contrary to what's promoted or was moved around as an idea or what it is, conveys it as an idea among some of the Sufis, that the Sheikh of Tariqah is more important than Sheikh of Ilm. That's nonsense. And the reason why that is because the Sheikh of Tariqah, if the Sheikh of Tariqah is not grounded in knowledge, the Sheikh of Tariqah will take you to bid'ah. So Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, who was one of the imams of tasawwuf in our time period meaning, within the last few hundred years, not necessarily within our time period exactly, but he was a reformer, and so was Sheikh Uthman Fodi. He followed people like Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, and he followed people like Sheikh Hastani and others, and Sha'rani, especially Sha'rani. Sha'rani, Imam Sha'rani, Imam Ahmed Zarruq, these people were people of reform. And so they rooted everything in knowledge the way that it was supposed to be. And of course, in understanding the life of the heart. So the two go together. The two go together. The idea of ilm and taqwa, it goes together. That's why even Imam Ibn Rajab, they talk about that knowledge without action is not really knowledge. So the earlier generations understood knowledge to be followed up by action. This is extremely important because the idea of knowledge that's conveyed is an idea of knowledge which is experiential, meaning that it's an idea of knowledge in which you're not really going to understand it unless you put it into practice, right? And understanding means that you have to have experience with the knowledge, lived reality. It's not only experiential, but it has that element to it. So the knowledge of the deen, that's why there was a lot of emphasis placed on defining iman as action, especially among the people outside of Iraq. Everything, I believe we can say west of Iran, right? And so when you start talking things like ilm al-kalam and other knowledge, other types of knowledge, it doesn't capture the original understanding of knowledge. That's another trajectory in knowledge. That's why some people were opposed to it. It has its place, but it doesn't capture the understanding of knowledge totally that's being conveyed in the Quran and in the Sunnah, which has a lot to do with implementing the deen. So we say that so that that understanding is there. right? The understanding of is there. So Ahmed Zarruq and others like that, they moved to reform the deen. I'm sorry, they moved to reform the acts of the people and revive the deen, right? And we mentioned that because these texts they have to be read with people of knowledge, and we mentioned that there should be no separation between action and knowledge. And we mentioned that even when it comes to things like taqwa, that taqwa needs knowledge. Taqwa needs knowledge. Remember the idea of walad dhalin in Surah Al-Fatiha. It has everything to do with practicing without knowledge, right? And al-maghdubi alayhim, it has everything to do with having knowledge without practice. And so we were warned about that, and that's the difficulty. Nifaq itself, nifaq itself, outside of it being kufr, because that's the highest level of nifaq or hypocrisy. But when we start talking about nifaq al-amali, or the nifaq that comes into our practice when we're deficient in practice, is there to show us that there's a gap between ourselves and the reality of the deen. And that's important because that's where the life of spirituality is at, to use that phrase or that term. You know, it has everything to do with that. Imam Ibn Qudama, I believe in the third volume, I'm not sure 100% what volume it is because in English it's translated into three volumes and they don't list on the front cover of the book. You have to look into it. But in any event, he abridged the Ihya Ulum al-Din of Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi, Ibn Qudama al-Hanbali. And the Minhaj al-Qasidin, which is the title of the book, right? The method or the way of those who are, aiming to reach the goal. And here the goal is to have taqwa, have a relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. He talks about the problem of delusion, which is I mention it because it's worthy to read, right? Because we could be extremely deluded. He tries to scientifically break it down. And it's funny because I've been in classes wherein behavior is looked at statistically. This amount of people are in accidents because of the alcohol consumption. This amount of people are in an accident due to negligence in terms of attention, just not being a careful driver as far as looking, seeing. This amount of people are in an accident because they're on their cell phones, which comes back to the issue of negligence, but they pinpoint it more specifically. And so then when you talk about the issue of accident reduction, the idea is that you have some statistics behind you that are telling you what are the conditions that if they're in place is more likely for you to get into an accident. If you're under the influence, if you didn't get enough sleep, if you are distracted, there's a lot of scenarios. And what's interesting with that is that none of us will question that from the angle of looking at it or deeming it to be a scientific study of behavior and it pointing to us about how to correct the behaviors. Because at the end of the day, all of the behaviors are modeled not just as dangerous behaviors, but as behaviors that contribute to fatalities. right? And so you have X amount of like 40 something thousand people die a year from car accidents. But there's a high number of how many car accidents take place every year. So it's the same concept when it comes to the life of the soul. The scholars, they attempted to pinpoint behaviors that can lead us to destruction, right? And so they isolate. They may not have the statistics with them, uh, but they have enough understanding to generalize from their experience. So that's important. So Imam Ibn Qudama, he talks about self-delusion. I mean, he's borrowing that as well from Imam al-Ghazali. Imam al-Ghazali is borrowing that from others, like people like al-Harith al-Muhasibi and others. Al-Harith was a contemporary of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, and they differed on methodology. Um, Imam al-Dhahabi, rahmatullahi alayhi, brings that up. But Imam Harith was from the earlier generations, just like Imam Ahmad. And Imam Harith had deep psychological insight. Psychological here means in the whole sense of the human being, right? Not just the rational mind. And so he would talk about the pathway to reform the self. Imam Ahmed, during that time, the Sunnah wasn't completely written. So he focused on a hadith and writing the hadith, but he had his way as well. And he was right to a certain extent that there's a necessity to ground things in the teachings of the deen, not just in personal experience, but also the knowledge of al-hadith was passed down and we inherited that knowledge. And in people like Ibn Qudama, they combined between that knowledge like that came from al-hadith and the knowledge of people like Imam Ahmed, right? Rahmatullahi alayhi. So we we can be deluded, and then even in such the Sahw, the conversation comes up: was it possible for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to forget? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did forget, but was reminded and protected. But the example of such the Sahw, some of the Sufis went to an extreme in saying no, that in reality he didn't forget, that he was just presenting it to the people in that way. And that's not true. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he modeled this for us as a human being, and that's where we get such this out. So in any event, the ruling of sunnah, sajda sahu being a sunnah, it doesn't apply in every case. And as we mentioned, uh, reading these texts needs some help and some guidance to decode. They're not read like textbooks. They have to be studied over and over again to really understand them. They're not read like textbooks, like modern textbooks that don't give you much opportunity to really think, because they kind of clarify things for you. It's a genius way of presenting information in the modern textbook, but it has its limitations as well. So these texts also, they have their limitations, and one of those things is that you need to review properly. So here it says, whoever forgets the two prostrations for forgetfulness that come before the salam, or are performed, they should be said better, before the salam, you should perform them if the time is close, the time of remembrance, close to the salah. That's what they mentioned. But if the time is elongated, if it's too much time that goes by that passes, uh, or if you left the masjid, right, you left the place of prayer, then the sajda sahu is invalidated, and the prayer is invalidated as well, because the prayer at that point in time is deficient, is deficient to an extent which affects its soundness, right? Its soundness. And then the exception to the rule here it comes up, the exception to the rule being that if it's three or more sunan, we mentioned also that the sunnah muakkada is not brought up here, right? And that mostly is not brought up in the whole of the text. We were dealing with that. Um, and this is one of the deficiencies in al-Akhdari in most books that are dealing with this. Now, pay attention to this. Sometimes you're seeing that it's saying two or more sunan, and here it's the khafifa, the sunnatul khafifa, or the lighter sunan that are not muakkadat. Pay attention to this point because myself, I had to pay attention to this, and it's very subtle. So, okay, here in this section, this is in the case three or more here. If you miss three or more, here is mentioned here. If you miss three or more, this is in this section here, people. This is in the section of el sajda sahu that's performed before the salam. And you forget to make it. You miss three or more sunan, you owe sajda sahu before the salam, and you forget to make it. In this scenario, if the time is close, that you remember to the salah itself, then you perform it. If the time is distant, or if you leave the space of prayer, then the sajda itself becomes invalidated. Now, the subtle thing is that it says here in this case for three or more, and forgetting to make the sajda. So the reason why I mentioned that is because here it says ولا يكون سجود القبل إلا لترك سنتين فأكثر. So the prostration for forgetfulness that's performed before the salam is not required except for the omission of two sunan or more. Do you see the difference? Am I being clear or unclear? Somebody give me some feedback. Very subtle point that could be missed. Anyone?
Yeah, I'm not gonna front. I'm a bit confused because all right, so you explained to us that three or more sunnahs, right, is required before the salams of the Sajdastaho, right? And then you brought up the two or more sunnahs, which is the Khafifa, and it's saying at the same it's the same time that we do the same thing. So I'm lost on the numbers. Or am I misunderstanding? I'm not sure.
Maybe the way that I explained it, but the section here is dealing with whoever forgets the sajda sahu. Okay, so the section here, that's the thing about traditional text that sometimes we can misunderstand them. Okay, so the section here is sajda al-Sahw. Okay, what do I do? What do I do if I forgot to make or perform the prostration for forgetfulness? That's the section. That this is the topic. When we come here, the topic changes. The topic is when am I required to make or perform sajda al-Sahw? And this one is before the salam. Here is in the case of forgetful. I forgot to make it. So then I run into the problem that if I forgot to make it, that forgetfulness now is classified into different types. I forgot to make it, but one, I remembered and I'm close in time to the salah. Put it in your language. I forgot I have to make a turn, but I still have enough time to make a turn on the road without it being hazardous or dangerous. Uh, Put it in your language. So the second is I forgot to make the turn. I'm too distant from the turning point to make a turn. So I had to keep going straight. And in this case, my salah is invalid. Or I left. I'm not even in the area now. You know, here I don't have enough time. There's just the time between me and the turn doesn't give me enough of an opportunity to make the turn. And the third scenario is I'm not even in the area anymore. I left the masjid. Does that make sense now?
Somewhat, yeah.
What doesn't make sense?
No, well, I'm starting to see what you're saying is that all right. So the first one you got up here is with the Sujud Saho, right? And you got it with the Sunnah Muakkada and the Khafifa,
Right.
right? So that is, what you're saying is like let's just say, right, you forgot to make this movement, right? But now you got to see how close in time are you? Like if you're from far away from let's say you just prayed Maghrib and the whole situation happened. That how far away are you from Maghrib? If not, do I have enough time to come back at it and hit it and hit my mistakes, clean it up? Is that what you're saying?
If I remember, if I pray salah and then I step out of salah and I remember, I I salam out. That's close in time. If I make salah and I salammed out and they have a program in the masjid. And the program is like an hour and a half. Maghrib was the salah that I was having issues with. Now it's time for Isha, an hour and a half, some maybe 2 hours later, even, depending on the masjid. Now, the Sajda Sahwi is invalid because of the distance and time. When does the Sajda Sahwi and my salah become invalid? In this case, it's saying if I forgot three or more sunan. But if otherwise, the prayer is not invalid. And we brought into that the sunan and muakkada. It's not mentioned. If you miss one of the sunan muakkadat or three or more of the sunan al-khafifa, then the sajda sahwi is invalidated due to either time issues or you're just like no longer in the prayer space. You get the concept now or no?
Yeah, I got you. I think I'm rolling with you on this one.
Okay,
Got you.
well, repeat it back because there's no use of
All right. So, all right, sir. Uh, in my words, it would be like prayed, right? And let's just say I forgot to do such a sahab because I missed one of the sunnahs, or two or more, or three or more, whether it's the khafifa or the muakkadah, right? So, and let's just say for some odd reason I say, yo, it's cheesesteak time. It's time. Give me cheesesteak. I bounce and I leave the masjid and I said, whoa, wait a minute. I messed up. I forgot to, you know what I mean, to do such a sahab. It's now my prayer is invalidated. It's no good no more. So I
right.
had to come back and do the whole thing over. But if I'm inside the masjid and like let's just say a couple minutes just roll by and I'm saying, yo, I forgot a movement here. I can come back and hit it because I still got time. I didn't leave and everything is close by. Is we Gucci or what?
But you didn't leave the masjid?
No, I didn't leave the masjid. I'm still there. I'm still in distance and I'm still in the time zone.
Yeah, then you're good. You're good.
Gucci.
That's the concept. But there's details to this because al-Akhdari is combining here the position that says the sahu is an obligation. Al-Akhdari is incorporating the idea that it's an obligation. Right? But that's why I mentioned here. This is why I mentioned this point of because we covered it before, but I wanted to cover it with more detail. Sajda sahu being a sunnah. That doesn't mesh with this, what we have here. It's not that he made a mistake or whatever, or it's a criticism. No, it's just that you have to understand the subtle shift in meaning. Because if you run with this, Sajda sahu is a sunnah, then this example here doesn't make sense. There's ways to explain it, but I'm talking about if you literally take what is said here. Sajda sahu is a sunnah. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? Because this saying just Allah is invalid. The Maliki school, one of the things is that in the Maliki school, there's a few ways of dealing with this issue, and I pointed to it before. In the Maliki school, this is one of the ways. It's not sunnah, and it is not an obligation in its initial state, but once you take it on, it becomes an obligation. The same thing with the sunan prayers or the nawafil or the fast. They're labeled as sun. They're labeled as sunan. But once you, contrary to the other madhab like the Shafi school and so on and so forth, if once you at the beginning, prior to you doing it, you're free. But once you do it, once you engage it, it's no longer a sunnah. It's an obligation for you to follow it all the way through. Whether it's a fast, whether it's a salah, the madhab has that thinking in it. You know what I'm saying? Like, okay, you want to pray the sunnah after dhuhr, and you forgot to pray it. Is it an issue? Not an issue. Okay, you wanted to pray the sunnah after dhuhr, you start to pray it, somebody calls you on your phone, you realize that it's from your work for whatever reason you figure that out. You get out of the salah to answer the call or some emergency or whatever. You still have to make up that salah. The same thing with fasting. Mondays and Thursdays is not an obligation to fast, but you say I'm gonna fast Mondays. So you take the fast, you start it off, and then you break the fast. Well, now you have to make that fast up based on the ayah لا تبطل أعمالكم. Don't invalidate your actions. The Hanafi school and the Maliki school in this are very similar, and these are the two older madhabs. That type of thinking is there. There's some other thinking that is there with regard to why it's considered an obligation in the case of even Sujud al-Qabli itself is considered to be an obligation, to be honest with you, because you're talking about covering deficiencies in the Salah. And you can keep building up proofs, which is something that it's good from the angle of taqwa as well. It's not just the angle of fiqh gymnastics. But if you think about your actions, why is it that we encourage to pray the sunnah? May Allah make it easy for us that are attached to the obligatory salahs. Anybody understands why it is that we're encouraged to pray those sunan?
Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I think I heard one one lecture where the brother was saying it's because the sunnahs protect the fard. Like if we do the sunnahs, we're gonna do the fara'id, so it's a reminder. It's kind of like a protection to get into the habit of the 5 daily prayers.
Anybody else? Because the sunan they complement the fara'id. They complement the fara'id. And so when when we are brought to account on the day of judgment, then these the sunan are looked at to see if there was anything in place so we can have coverage for the deficiencies that we had in the fara'id. It's kind of like a reserve bank account type of idea, right? Aside from the fact that the Prophet ﷺ um, prayed them with frequency or consistency, there's this idea of protection of the fard, complementing the fard. And there's some textual evidences in that regard, that point to that reality of the sunan being, that which are looked at on the day of Yom al-Qiyamah and so on and so forth. And also, even when we say, for instance, when we say astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah after the salah, it is in case there's a deficiency in it, because it's possible for there to be a deficiency in it. So I want us to look at that in light of Sujud al-Sahw itself, how much of a mercy it is, because it allows us to safeguard whatever good that we did without invalidating it, because we made a mistake, right? It's part of the nature of the human being. That's why some Sufi groups that claim that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't forget, and they try to paint it as an illusion. That's not a proper way of looking at things. There's a hadith from Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu. He said, the first action for which a servant of Allah will be held accountable, may Allah make it easy on us, on the day of resurrection. I'm adding, may Allah make it easy on us, right? But the hadith says the first action for which a servant of Allah will be held accountable on the day of resurrection will be the salah, or his prayers or her prayers, right? If they are in order, he will have prospered and succeeded. If they are lacking, he will have failed and lost. If there is something defective in his obligatory prayers, then the Almighty Lord will say, see if my servant has any voluntary prayers that can complete what is insufficient in his obligatory prayers. The rest of his deeds will be judged in the same way. The hadith is powerful in that regard. The Salafis in the Salafi circles, they go with the judgment of Sheikh al-Albani for the most part. So Sheikh al-Albani considered the hadith to be sound, but the hadith is in Tirmidhi, hadith of Abu Huraira. And the hadith has a lot of wisdom in it. So here, the Sajda Sahu, in the case of forgetting it, it leads to the invalidation of the Salah. And I want to emphasize that because a lot of times we're negligent, or we're just going through so much in our minds that we kind of become laxed because there's so much stuff going on emotionally and mentally, and it's overwhelming. But this type of knowledge is is very helpful because it allows us to monitor. For me, I think more so than the whole issue of salah being valid or invalid, that's important. But for me, this gives you a scale to kind of see where you're at. Does anybody understand what I'm saying? How does it give you a scale to see where you're at? How does it really?
I feel like it helps me tighten up. Like when I'm offering salah, I'm mindful of whether or not, I'm engaging in certain actions that are recommended or required, um, or encouraged, just because we've spent time going over it detail by detail. Like it helps me just kind of analyze, like, how much effort I'm putting into the salah.
Anybody else?
Everybody's quiet today.
What do you say about that, Resto Hanif? I don't know if Hazel's with us.
I'm here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum salam tullah.
Just thinking. Um, One thing about Salat in particular that I've been trying to inculcate within my children as I continue to perform my own Salat is that the reminder that it is an obligation and to have the khushu', but as well to not have it be something that feels like a burden. So I try to remind my boys that this is our time to decompress. This is our time to meet with our Lord,
Mm.
and we get to pray. Because Iman and Salat is gifted to us, and it is something that not everybody has the privilege to have. And so, really trying to have them understand, and a reminder for myself that this is my time to connect with Allah, and this is their time to connect to Allah and meet with the Creator. And we get to pray. Yes, we have to, but what a blessing that we get to.
There's been a lot of debates about the whole issue of seeking intercession or help, from people other than from people that are labeled as or considered to be saints or awliya or whatever. And some of you may be familiar with those debates that are taking place. They're very old debates, but I find it to be not necessarily useful from the angle of it's a distraction. So the question becomes, and this is just a reminder for all of us, for myself, firstly, but when everything, when stuff hits the fan, how do you handle the situation? That becomes the question. Like, how do you handle when life is on the terms of life, so to speak, right? Not on your terms, meaning that it's not necessarily going your way. Um, how do you handle that? Where do you turn when all the doors are closing and so on and so forth on you? And so the point of the salah being, firstly, let's rewind a little bit. The whole concept of halal haram, the way that we have it, and some have criticized the fiqh of Iraq for this. The fiqh of Iraq eventually became, fiqh of Iraq was pretty expansive, but eventually the Hanafi madhab became that which was expressive of it. And I'm not necessarily I'm not in a position to criticize the Hanafi madhab, but there was a thinking that was there that was very legalistic, very legalistic. You know what I'm saying? And so it kind of created a certain culture that advanced our legal thinking, but it became very formalistic. And that is not necessarily a criticism of the Hanafi madhab, is more of an attitude. And you find some cultures they have that. The reason why I'm mentioning is that because all that stuff was late on the scene. the legalistic thinking, the all these details in the salah and this point and that point and this madhab and that madhab, all that is late. But in the earliest generation, and we talked about the Quranic foundation, and we asked Allah to give us that reality, there was a state of the heart that preceded the rules. And that's why some spiritual teachers, so to speak, they try to create the conditions for people to have that. So the salah itself, the term salah means sila, is a connecting point. It's like a rope. Is that which connects us. So when we have, how do we cry out to Allah? That's what I'm saying. Like the earlier generation, salah was extremely important for them in that regard. So when we look at all of these things here, the first thing that comes up is like, are we conscious of what's going on? That's why even the big debates among the ulama about whether abandoning the salah is kufr or not, if it's unbelief or not, had a lot to do with it was so serious to them that there was no deen without it, right? There was no deen without the salah. For us, it may be a struggle. For some of us, for one of us, it may be a struggle. For others, it may not be. But the reality is that even performing it is not enough. Uh, I mean, on your bad days, it is enough. Whatever you can do. But in terms of checking ourselves, in terms of the tazkiyat nafs, if you want to say tasawwuf, whatever you want to say in that regard, when you start looking at your state of presence of mind, like where are we at, right? When we are in the point where we're not completely there, we find ourselves like, what is causing us not to perfect our wudu? What is causing us not to be totally present in heart and mind in the salah? Because one of the beautiful things about the Hanafi school too, even like the idea of presence is there from the angle that if you're a follower and you don't know you're a follower, you technically don't have to pray the Al-Fatiha in the Hanafi school. So there's this indication that what is important is being totally present before Allah wa ta'ala. Of course, that's not in the Maliki school, the idea of not praying the Al-Fatiha or reciting Al-Fatiha. But the idea that I'm attempting to communicate is that presence before God, the one that controls everything, right? The presence before Allah wa ta'ala that controls everything, that nothing escapes the knowledge or the will of Allah wa ta'ala. So then when we look at these types of things, you know, what state of mind are you in? That's the whole point. You know what I'm saying? Like I was mentioning the cell phone thing, like because that becomes a reality that we're praying under the gun. Sometimes people they're praying in such a way that it's just like they're almost like hiding in their prayer because they're doing it at work. They're in between this, that. The mother is caught up with her children. The person that is in marital disputes, you know what I'm saying? They're just so overwhelmed by what's going on that even the salah, they just shut down. I've done enough counseling and lived enough life to know that, they shut down. So even you ask, where's the salah? Oh, I'm not praying too much. Where the situation becomes more and more intense because there's no, like, how are you getting a grasp of your situation? Allah tabarak wa ta'ala in that regard is, in control. So the idea here is to make the salah that sense of highest importance and remove the nifaq, remove the incongruency between what is that we say we believe, and what it is that we do. You know what I'm saying? That and it's not a judgment on anybody. It's that's how the tazkiyat nafs takes place, right? One thing that I'll give credit to the Islamic movement, you know, the idea of dhikr. Dhikr became known as you have your dhikr beads, your sheikh gives you, but dhikr is not that. That's a very limited understanding of what dhikr is. Dhikr is to be in mindful of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Dhikr is the salah, is the recitation of the Quran, is the implementation of the deen. It is the making tasbih, right? But the tasbih part, it's very limited. You know what I'm saying? It's a lifestyle in that regard. And even Sayyid Nursi, rahmatullahi alayhi, one of the things he mentioned was like, in the time period where Islam was really established in Muslim majority countries, the whole idea of a dhikr routine as far as tasbihat and all of that, that was for perfection of the self. That wasn't for establishing the deen in your life. That was because the deen was established in your life and you want to keep growing in the deen, growing, because everything in the society was, for the most part, like we're not going to over exaggerate, but it was a reminder of the hereafter. It was a reminder of Allah wa ta'ala. So the deen itself was complemented by those perfection type programs. But now the foundations of the deen are thrown off and we're jumping ahead of ourselves. We're jumping ahead of ourselves. It's like the person who says, no, I want to learn the deen from Quran and the Sunnah, and you have no idea how to really benefit from the Quran and the Sunnah directly, right? That's not to say that's not a noble pursuit, right? But how do you make sense of the knowledge? So that's why the other sciences are important. That's why the other types of knowledge is important, so that you can benefit from the Quran and the Sunnah. So the same thing, the foundation has to be in place in order to benefit. And some of the mashaykh, they say things that are just like the dhikr is more important than the salah, and that they mean the dhikr, the tasbihat, because it gives you presence of mind. But that type of thinking is off. The foundation is when we look at the arkan of the deen as being pivotal, as being essential, and then everything else is complementary to that, right? And it just kind of keeps everything flowing and going. And it's not, I'm not here to criticize or to say this is bid'ah or that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about putting things in the proper order. So, Sajda Sahu, one of the things that I want us to take away from it is that human beings are made to forget, are made to be imperfect. That's why there's Sajda Sahu, that's why there's Tawbah.